We are now speaking about strategy for more equal distribution of power, and I think we share the common view that in a global human society the distribution of power has to be more equal. Its prevailing distribution is largely responsible for the destruction of nature, poverty, hunger, and inhuman living conditions. In the age of the Anthropocene, it is not a further growth of things and not only a redistribution of things, but the reorganization of the interrelations between people. The redistribution of social power can unfold the human potential and create a fair and more equal global society. The highest priority for more equal distribution of social power is an all-embracing, human-centered education. At the same time, we should be aware that the material and immaterial obstacles of a transition in a new society is very important too. From the perspective of power, we can distinguish three basic means of power: the ownership of material and immaterial property, the kind of organization of these properties, and the ideology, or better named, the values according to which these properties and its organization are handled. As property, organization, and values are highly interdependent, a human-centered education can change the organization of the society and also the distribution of the ownership. But the change of the values is only one of the three basics of power, and I will refer mainly here on the ownership and the organization of the society. To get grip of the immense complexity of the society, I will restrain my considerations to four forms of power: financial power, economic, political, and social power, which are influence each other. We can imagine, for example, that if social power of the population increases and tames the financial and economic powers, which gives more room to political power, can enhance the development for a human society. This kind of distribution of power describes roughly our considerations, and at the end of our discussion here, I will conclude that the redistribution of power will need a more coherent organization of the human capital, which does not exist actually. I will discuss the problem in 6 points: less industrial countries, industrialized countries, financial power, economic power, and social power. And finally, I will give some resume. At the global level, social power is highly uneven distributed, which originates from colonialism and is not equalized by existing trade arrangements and even less by the financial flows. If we distinguish very roughly between industrialized and less industrialized countries, the latter have an enormous potential of natural and human resources, but they are, whatever their criteria may be, less organized than industrial countries, which have established a huge machinery with many detrimental consequences. attempts to create regional economic areas like Mercosur, Asian countries, and so on, and trading blocs and regional currencies are hopes, but they are largely rest largely on the advances of global governance, the nucleus of which are the United Nations with its organizations. Although the 17 sustainability goals and the Paris Agreement are globally accepted, their implementation is highly endangered by the still reigning neoliberalism, which does not reduce the gaps of power, and considerations to pay back partly the exploitations of the colonialism is beyond the free market thinking. There are several reform proposals for trade and direct investments which could ameliorate the power position of less industrial countries. The World Trade Organization should be complemented by agreements on global social and environmental standards, and for multinational firms, a legally binding code of conduct could be ratified, which can ameliorate working conditions and protect nature. Instead of adopting the free market ideology, the IMF and the World Bank could take into consideration more social and ecological criteria, which applies also for the G7 and G20. But even these rather moderate proposals are very marginally implemented and can hardly change the global power relations. A more advanced proposal is a global Marshall Plan or a global New Deal, which intends, may it be financed by the states or directly from the financial markets, to refund partly the cost of former colonialism. Both are important, but equally important are strategy to increase the direct investments and above all the establishment of educational systems there. Both could cooperate with the rapidly growing alternative sector with its non-profit enterprises, microcredits and so on, for which legal clarification of properties on land and other properties are vital. In the triangle of the ownership, organization and values, the urgency of more democratic structures are needed, abolishing corruption and things like this are evident. In terms of power, economic power could be enhanced by a fair cooperation of the emerging alternative sector with the increasing direct investments. Political power could enhance by more democratic governance, and social power by the establishment of a human-centered educational system. Without going into details, we can say that the globally uneven distribution between industrialized and less industrialized countries rests to a large extent to more industrial investments in the so-called third world. But even all these problems in the less industrial countries does not reduce the responsibility of the industrial world. Although global consciousness increases in industrial countries and leads to more global cooperation, the so-called First World acts to a large extent self-referentially. This is visible in the concentration of direct investments and trade between industrial countries, the financial centers in New York, London and Tokyo, and the welcome culture during the recent immigration. The north of the world attracts increasingly more real and financial capital, and finally people to fill up their population gaps. And it is not the globalization of real production what is intended by the industrial countries. At the same time, the industrial world suffers from over-accumulation of real capital and lacking final demand. They adopt mercantilistic strategy which enforces emerging countries to export-led growth, by which they neglect their internal social development. Also, we had in the past bad experiences with direct investments. We have to increase them considerably, combined with legally binding codices and with the export of socio-ecological technologies. The big fear of losses of jobs by offshore investments cannot be compensated by higher growth in industrial countries, but only by a reduction of working time and more human instead of real and financial capital investments. The expanding discussion about the socio-ecological market economy represents a first step out from the self-referential bias of the industrial countries. Being more aware of the limits of the global natural capital, they reduces, in fact, energy and capital inputs in favor of higher innovation, which needs more human capital and results in a low growth path. Traditional high ex-post social expenses should be replaced by ex-ante social investments, a turn from taxation of labor to real and financial capital, and enlarging reforms of the financial sector. A socio-ecological market economy is an important step for a transition into a human society, but it is centered still around a modified capital accumulation. What is needed is that humans and social capital becomes the center of gravity for real and financial capital accumulation, and capital should become just an instrument for higher security, welfare, and well-being. Starting and going from such a socio-ecological economy and going beyond, there should be an acceleration of human-centered education and reorganization of political, economic, and social power, so that it will be more equally distributed, including the ownership of real and financial capital, which is necessary both for the industrial and the less industrial countries. By this, we can come to what is already the common wisdom, that in face of the limits of the earth, the growth rates in less industrial countries have to be higher than those in the industrial countries for a converging world. We already mentioned that as there exists no coherent global governance, the really globally governing institution are the financial markets, producing many inhuman consequences. Enhanced by the free market ideology, financial markets collect the savings surpluses from the industrial countries, the upstream savings from the less industrial countries, and the nearly unlimited creation of money by banks, which produces huge debts the repayment of which shortens global demand and contributes to global stagnation. Central banks like the Fed, ECB, and the Bank of Japan issues enormous quantities of artificial money and reduce the money interest rate sharply without increasing real investments. The following inflation augments unequal wealth distribution, increases speculation, and endangers also states, now in Europe and partly in Japan, and pressures on many credit-demanding small and medium firms, including socio-ecological projects of the alternative sector. Paradoxically, the financial sector absorbs many of the best brains. In the 2008 financial crisis, this was a certain wake-up, but after minor corrections, it is again a pending threat and an absolute contradiction of a transition into a human society. Political and academic institutions are well aware of these threats. They propose a wide range of reforms, reaching from debt reduction by monetizing, haircuts, heavy taxation, and the dissolution of tax oases, splitting the banking system into business and investment banks, bonus rating agencies, and so on. But if we look at their implementation, nearly nothing could be done. Experts say that the financial sector became more powerful than states, and the productive sector accepts it because large firms act partly like banks, and by this become part of the financial system. The large population is also, it furnishes about 40% of total real savings, widely excluded from any participation in decision and ownership. And for the majority of people, it is a rather anonymous power, not far from the understanding of nature some centuries ago. Provided that money is in the right hands, it is a very powerful instrument for a transition, but actually its ownership is extremely concentrated within the globally closed system of the financial area. However, progressively there is a tendency toward the multipolar currency system. Decentralization beyond the dollar and the euro areas will allow the tectonic plates of Asia and Latin America to arrange their increasingly specific trade relations and their production structure. Such regional currencies could be further disaggregated to local regions, including barter. Decentralization would permit more legal democratic control of the central banks, which are actually in cooperation with the private banks, nearly exclusively governing by the financial elite, like in Wall Street, in funds, and so on. Reducing the globally huge deficits and the fictional money would bring the economy closer to real production of the traditional sector and the alternative sector. Political power is a necessary ingredient to correct these tendencies toward a multipolar currency system. Actually, the real sector production in industrial countries is mainly governed by the financial sector, but there is a considerable increase of the alternative sector, which may, in a few decades, embrace half of the total population production. If we look at the traditional sector, composed by industrial and service sector, we find a constantly augmenting a substitution of labor by capital, and by this increasing employment. By this, real capital owners gains more social power vis-à-vis the employees, visibly in the decreasing wages, and relatively augmenting returns on capital. Although in current years there are manifold innovations like energy saving, application of ICT, robotization, and share economy, the unchanged basic strategy are still to strengthen the management of production and to gain influence on market exchanges. Whatever the concept of management is, it is capital-oriented and includes hierarchies which exerts power on the employees, resulting often in physical and mental diseases and or employment. Generally speaking, there is a tacit coalition between the financial capital holders and real production management, enhanced by the Anglo-American business schools, which sustains the freedom and creativity of employees. On the exchange, on the markets, we find increasingly oligopolies, which represent also a hierarchy within the exchanges in the society. Concerning the moderate reform proposals, we have many softenings of the power structures within the production sector. They range from decentralizing competition policy to strategy of the humanization of work by techno-organizational changes, and to different forms of soft management with the intention to increase the entrepreneurial behavior of the employees, and finally, the codices for good management and corporate social responsibility. So we have a clear tendency toward the re-evaluation of the human factor, but their factual implementation as well as the real turn to a human-centered real production is still lacking. Human-centered organization of the real sector has to accept hierarchies which are unavoidable in any organization. But there is a tremendous difference between a capital-centered or a human-centered hierarchy or heterarchy. Such a turn can only partly be accomplished by universally called accepted human rights, and should ensure the dignity of workers by more humanized production technologies, the additional cost of which can be more outweighed by the gains of creativity and productivity. A precondition is a vigorous return to the cooperation between firms, management, and employees instead of the cooperation between the financial sector and the management, a participation of workers in the capital ownership and management decisions. Small and medium firms and the alternative sector practice it with success, and large firms have in many cases enough financial capital for a decoupling from the financial markets. The formal political power is mainly institutionalized by the constitutional law at the level of nation states, with its different sub-levels at provinces, at communities, and the division of legislative, executive and judicative powers. Such democratic structures rest on the majority rules, according to which political parties govern, and their successes depend highly on the degree to which the population adheres to the values of democracy. Within this framework, we have a lot of semi-public organizations like business association, trade unions, and increasingly the civil society with its NGOs and parts of the alternative sector, partly coordinated by internet. They gain increasingly political influence. By this, complexity of the society and its power distribution increased, and the formal democratic structures are overlapped by informal power. For example, central banks have no democratic legitimation to issue more and more money, and large multinational concerns influenced by lobbying not only the executive but also the legislative procedures and results. In these examples, there is no legal abuse, but a distance to the political values of the large population, which is charged to the politicians and ultimately to democracy itself. Democracy is endangered by the difficulties to canalize formal and informal powers into real democratic procedures, and political parties tend to plutocracy with revolving its own personnel and follow mainly the opinion polls without living their own values. No question, a lack of morality and ethical political values of the former statesmen are replaced by populistic tendency, which tend also to right-wing's policy and undermine not only democracy, but also the value system of the population. Also, political leaders are submit to such tendency of populism. The main influences come from the financial and the economic power, which excludes participation of the larger population. If we look at the high influence of financial sector on rating agency, threats of states, of bankruptcy, political parties and leading politicians are prone to them. The same is true for the real sector, and it is not only that we have a lack of political leadership. The main reason for a deviation from the democratic procedures is are the influences of the financial and the real sector and the deficiency in the political power structure itself. So finally, I would shortly refer to the most important social power, which consists of the population. Purely economic estimations show that about nearly 80% of the total resources in industrial countries is human capital. As individuals own themselves, it seems to be quite natural that they realize their values, and as they are always embedded in social surroundings, they should create a human capital as a social organization. So what I vote for is that the existing social power in the different levels of the population should be much more organized, and we should not speak of an Anthropocene in the Anthropocene discussion of mankind, but mankind itself is a highly complex system, which we have shortly discussed under the perspective of power. What we know is that we need a switch from the natural perspective of the ecologists to the social perspective, and we have to create a consciousness of the, not only of the biosphere, but also of the power structures in the society. If we think how to organize this social capital, we may learn from the history of the development of the financial and economic powers, because they have their specific kind of organization in the last century mainly, and also the rise of the green powers rests on an increased number of people and green values, and they are globally very well organized. If we think that power structures and the transition into a human society is important, we have to know the obstacles, but we have at the same time positively organized the social capital with using the internets, the different kind of activities which globally exist. And this is mainly this kind of organization, like the financial power, the political power, and the real sector power, we should tend to create an idea how we can globally organize the social capital, because we have the properties of the people, we have also the organization then if we develop, and the values comes out from an increasingly human-centered education. Thank you.